is you end up having the black kids empowered by virtue of their reinforced victimhood, and the white kids become sometimes a bit timid, reluctant to say anything, reluctant to challenge anything, because they are now guilty of whatever it is the black kids feel. And to my mind, that approach, and I call it CRT, we can call it whatever you like actually, but that's essentially the modus operandi, I think is incredibly, incredibly destructive.
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm filling for Petrus. Petrus is currently collecting slave reparations for the ANC. This is WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today we're talking with Sara Gon. Sara is the head of strategic engagement at the Institute of Race Relations. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So Sara, like I told you before we started, this critical race theory is extremely interesting and somewhat disturbing. But for our viewers, can you tell us what is critical race theory?
Okay. Let me give you the really short answer, because it's quite a complex issue to deal with, because it has its origins in academia. Essentially, it's the idea is that whites form part of the oppressor class, and the oppressor class is always predominantly are blacks. It's a theory that was developed in the United States and has grown to include a range of other minorities. And by this, it looks at gender, women, it looks at sexual preference, sexual orientation, people that fill those groupings, shall I say. And the idea being that as long as that everything about society is this issue of power relations, and as a result, as long as you have the whites in power or the effects of white power dominating a society, that has to be overcome, and the minorities, those who've been disadvantaged, the oppressed, need to find their right, they need to essentially achieve their right place in society. And what they usually mean by that is, at the end of the day, the entire society, the political systems, must be completely overturned. So usually the attack is on capitalism as being typical of white oppression, and it's capitalism that must be reversed, I assume, for socialism, for Marxism. That's essentially the ideological basis that falls behind critical race theory.
And the chief opponent is white males. They are the main enemies.
Yes, they are the main enemies. They're essentially deemed as having been, it's really formed around the history that is specific to the United States. So what they're saying is white men founded America, and at some point 200 years ago, blacks were brought in as slaves from Africa into America and were largely harshly treated, which I'm sure is absolutely correct. 200 years of slavery was eventually abolished, but that all the hangovers from that era has continued, since white men in particular have continued to be dominant. And they have really formed society as we know it, and that the very existence of that influence is what has to be changed in favor of those who continue to remain to be oppressed. And that's so yes, white men are pretty much it.
But I mean, who oppressed them before the Europeans came along?
Well, you see, that's one of my criticisms with the basis for what's become critical race theory is that it's very selective about the history that it chooses. And although 200 years of slavery in America may mean one thing, it may be a very different scenario almost anywhere else in the world. And so, for example, what's pertinent to perhaps our situation is the fact that slavery affected a group of people who now currently constitute about 13% of the American population. In South Africa, apartheid would fill the same role. It was an egregious history. It was very brutal in so many respects. But there you had a minority of white men oppressing blacks. And since the change, since democracy and the change in dispensation, you have a democratic black majority country with a minority of whites. I mean, it sounds a bit simplistic. Now, that's important because when a majority has control of the political system, it's the minorities are always under threat of even of the sort of the rule of the democratic majority. That being simply by virtue of numbers. In other words, it wouldn't theoretically be difficult if one were faced with a government who wants to push beyond democracy into something more autocratic. Minority groupings, whoever they are, whether they be whites or any other minority, are much more vulnerable to the predations of an autocratic government. And if your white minority is at the mercy of a government that represents a black majority, that's when you really test your democracy, is the extent to which minorities are safe from majority predation. And my concern, particularly with critical race theory, and particularly in the field I'm looking at in schools, is that we work from the premise that South African society is forever a work in progress with regard to improving race relations. We also, a lot of the Institute of Race Relations work, our polling has shown that concern over racism, while by no means not an issue, is not one of the main issues that worry people. If we usually ask questions, and have over the last 5 or 6 years, when we do our surveys on the living conditions generally of South Africans, it's not confined to race, it's much, much broader. But there is a section that asks people to list or to indicate what they think is the biggest issue for them. We don't give them any suggestions. We don't provide a list. It is for them to state, and we then see where the most or least issues arise. Without fail, every year, unemployment is the number one issue. Always, always, always. Now, 2 and 3 and 4 may be education, can be drug abuse, and the effect of addiction on communities, can be health, can be schooling. Those are the most common, or it can be crime. The criminal system, and to what extent it is resolving or not, the perceptions and the experiences people have of crime. There are 2 issues that always come at the bottom, either 11 and 12 or 13 and 14. Land and racism. And that's certainly not to say, as I say, that they are not issues and they are not problems, but they are not the problems that tend to be portrayed in the media. And to my mind, in any event, you've always got to work at improving race relations, at improving people's understanding of each other. And my concern is that critical race theory as a way for improving race relations is a very poor option, because, as we'll get into, it basically, to my mind, runs the risk of doing the opposite.
Absolutely. And it's interesting what you say. It's basically a minority that's pushing this because nobody finds this as important. But an article that you wrote that I found very interesting is where you list specific examples of how critical race theory is being taught in schools. Can you give us some of those examples? Because many of them are frightening.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I must say, obviously, our examples are taken from approaches we've had from parents. Usually it's been from parents. It's starting now, we're starting to get approaches from teachers. And it's some research a colleague of mine and I have been doing. And the pattern that we've discerned so far that will result in critical race theory being brought in as a method for dealing with allegations of racism will usually start with one or a group of students claiming that racism has occurred. It may be another student, it may be a teacher. Then what happens, and this is most predominantly at this stage in private schools, there's a bit of panic sets in, and the school management will get advice, and the next thing is a consultant who's an expert on diversity issues will come in, I presume, at a reasonably fortuitous rate financially for the consultant, and sort of the things that very often will be an issue of will be things what's commonly, and you'll have been aware of this through the media, is complaints that Black girls' hair is not dealt with the same sort of care or appropriate response as white girls' hair. That's an issue we've seen a number of times. Or a child will say that a teacher has said something racist or done something in class that they consider racist or hurtful. Now, the problem is that, let me put it this way, my concern is that there are other ways of dealing with it. But what tends to happen, following this pattern, is that suddenly the entire school becomes the subject of they have to deal with racism. They must educate the kids on racism. So racism becomes an issue above all issues that has to be dealt with. And somewhere along the line, and it's very difficult, I can't tell what consultants say to Black kids, but they usually separate the kids out at some point. I don't know what they say because we haven't had it from the Black student side. But what the white parents get very concerned of is the white students are called aside, and the consultant will then deal with them and explain to them their white supremacy, their fragility, what they call their white fragility, which is their sort of tendency to do things that are hurtful to Blacks. Sorry, my cardidas are out of control. To Black children, they basically essentially say that they are responsible by virtue of their whiteness for the system that exists, the system that existed, that perpetuated the racism. And essentially, it boils down to the fact that what a consultant will do is say to white kids that the color of their skin reflects that they are part of or the progeny of a society that brutalized and that committed racism. And what ends up happening is that those white kids may feel guilty. They will often tell their parents what's happened, and that's when we get told of what's happened, is that instead of it being an issue that is dealt with openly, frankly, and combined to discuss issues and look at what are the things people how they need to regard each other, the things people should be more respectful of in each other, and in other words, deal with each other, deal with the kids on a positive basis as to what is necessary to improve relationships, increasing their understanding of where people come from, but not to segment people into where they come from based essentially purely on the color of their skin, and it works from there. So of course what happens is you end up having the Black kids empowered by virtue of their reinforced victimhood, and the white kids become sometimes a bit timid, reluctant to say anything, reluctant to challenge anything, because they are now guilty of whatever it is the Black kids feel. And to my mind, that approach, and I call it CRT, we can call it whatever you like actually, but that's essentially the modus operandi, I think is incredibly, incredibly destructive.
Especially for a young person, because he doesn't have the critical faculties yet to challenge something like this. So, I mean, it's extremely dangerous. It can lead to depression or even suicide.
Sure. No, look, and if you think about it, I mean, when you're looking at kids, and you're looking at teenagers in particular, teenagers can be brutal, and you've got social media. So while social media can certainly be a source of racism, I mean, adults will go onto social media, as we've seen in the past, and say or do racist things. The same can happen the other way, and it becomes a form of bullying. And also, it's probably problematic for Black kids, because if this doesn't strike them as a rational, commonsensical way to do things, they become inhibited, or they eventually fall in with the crowd. And that's not the way something like race relations should be dealt with. And part of the reflection of the fact that this has Marxist theory behind it, is the emphasis on power relations, And two is the idea that if you, and this is a very Marxist idea, it's not a unique idea, but it's a very Marxist idea, that if you inculcate children with an idea that you want them to grow up with, they're yours. Because for the very reasons you've given, that minds are not yet fully formed, kids are immature. I mean, we've seen examples in the States. I haven't yet had an example brought to me, but I'm sure it probably happens, where children of mixed marriages, of multicultural marriage, whatever you want to call them, go home traumatized because they are taught to see their black father as good and their white mother as bad, and they can't necessarily filter out these
Wow.
issues. And to my mind, that gives you the perfect example of what is wrong with critical race theory. What do you say that the black parent must be the better parent, the dominant parent? I mean, it's an extraordinary brutal thing. That to me is the example of, if you want one reason why critical race theory is not a good idea, that's a bit basic, but that's a fundamental reason.
Now that's definitely disturbing. Is there also a connection between critical race theory and a determination to rewrite history? Are they also trying to rewrite history?
I'm not so much sure. Well, sometimes they are. I mean, sometimes recently you've seen something like the 1619 Project, which basically holds that America was founded when the first black slaves arrived. And that is a distortion of history. That's not to say, and I know from friends of mine, relatives in America, that the teaching of American history and the bad sides of American history, and there are very bad sides of American history, and slavery was certainly a significant one, is not always even and is not always thorough. And so there's always grounds for teaching a history properly to include the good and the bad. There, South Africa, the same. But the problem is that it is when you're selective about your history. Now, for example, South Africa is in no way affected by American history. What happened, the periods of slavery in America had no impact on South Africa. But if you want to look at slavery, I mean, slavery is almost as old as humanity. And worse than that, I actually just saw a snippet from a program which was talking about, there's a documentary dealing with modern slavery, meaning there are millions of people who are still in forms of slavery in parts of the world. Indian subcontinent, East Asia, Southeast Asia, North Africa in particular.
Women slaves. We've spoken a few days to a person who fought for women slaves' rights. It's a massive problem.
Yeah, it's women slaves, it's children, it is men. And the thing is that very often, I mean, slavery was often an automatic result of military conquest. And different parts of the world dealt with slavery differently. What was unusual about slavery of the Anglophone world was that it was actually abolished by the slave masters eventually. And England was first, and America followed, and eventually Brazil. But, you know, that's in many parts of the world, it either sort of gradually died out or it hasn't died out at all. And there's something fundamentally self-absorbed about concentrating on your past history as determining your future when your past is somebody else's present. And that doesn't worry you one iota. And of course, there's another fundamental unfairness, and this applies to any form of horror. And that is whether it be genocide, and I'll use the Holocaust as an example. You can't hold the children of Germans who lived in Germany during the war. You can't hold all of Germans responsible for Nazi Germany, but you certainly can't hold their children responsible. It's an awful thought, and I don't think there are any Jews today who may be descended from or even be the children of living Holocaust survivors who would consider living Germans to be responsible for the consequences of the Holocaust. And the same has to apply with apartheid. When a system changes or ends, that is not to say your history is not important to you. Of course it is, and it does have profound effects on you. Whether it's the British concentration camps affecting Afrikaners, the Holocaust affecting Jews, slavery affecting black. But there's a lovely saying that goes very much along the lines of, your future must not be determined by your past, it must only be informed by it. Because if you're stuck in your past, if your past becomes everything that you're relying on your past to determine your future, you'll actually be stuck.
Definitely. And another example would be if the Boers, the Afrikaners, still had animosity towards the English for keeping their wives and families in concentration camps. But they've gotten over that. That's also why they've managed to grow, probably.
Well, you see, the thing is that, I mean, I certainly, all impressions I've had from talking to Afrikaans friends is how big the concentration camps under the English, what a lasting impact that had. And it's part of the history that will go to explaining the rise of apartheid. And then the same likewise is that the colonialism and apartheid will explain where Black South Africans are at to some extent. But the point is that knowing from history is a society can help you improve your life, but at the end of the day, it is up to you to make the best of any help, or to seek the help, or to respond to the help. If you don't get the help, and arguably this is where the ANC has done so badly in the last 12, 13, 14 years, is that improvements that were being made stopped being made because of cadre deployment, state capture, etc., etc. And so what most of us are saying is that those things that should help uplift people have gone missing. And that's probably the most distressing thing about where we live now, is that people who should have been able to progress because of better education, better opportunities, better health, are stuck.
We tend to focus on the wrong things in the country. The past is important, but we're living in the present. But on the subject of critical race theory, isn't it also something that the apartheid government would have approved of? Isn't something, wouldn't they have applied this just in reverse and with a... Yes?
In a way, because it's essentially about group rights. Well, not group rights. Yeah, let's call it group rights, because it identifies, I mean, one of the completely horrific aspects of apartheid, particularly coming after a horrific world war, and moving into an era of human rights with the establishment of the United Nations, and then South Africa went the other way. Now, South Africans, we should be all too aware of the horror of being identified, being determined, and having our history assumed by the color of our skin. I mean, there's nothing more shallow than operating on the basis of this person's black, that person's white. Nobody knows what anybody else may or may not have come from, suffered from, may currently suffer. Our skin tells us, it may be an indicator, but it is not a predictor. And so it's a terrible, terrible way of determining how people should see each other. And that's even, you know, let's say the looking at women, or homosexuality. We've reached a point with the gay rights that has reached a point, I think many gays, particularly my generation, would not necessarily have expected to ever reach in terms of rights and recognition and acceptance. A hard battle was fought, and no battle's ever completely won, because you're always going to have people out there who have bigotry of some form or another. The aim is to try and reduce the level of bigotry to a minimal level. If not, you can't. It's just never. You're never going to. God forbid we should be so lucky as to completely eliminate bigotry. What you want to do is try and work towards eliminating, and hope you do your best. And again, it's the case of, why are you responding and teaching kids to respond to each other based on something as facile as the color of their skin? It's actually an appalling idea. Or whether they're female or male, or whether they are gay or straight, or religious, of a religious grouping or not of a religious grouping.
But I mean,
understand them better. Yes.
But I mean, on that note, why do they do this? I mean, especially in a country where the majority are black, why are they teaching black victimhood? What is the main rationale behind this?
I think it's, you know, I mean, it's literally been imported lock, stock, and barrel. And you saw it's first happening with the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall movement. The 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 processes have been coming in, but they really reached public expression out in a way that people could see it in academia, whereas academia keeps things fairly close to its chest for as far as the outside world is concerned. But it is an import. It makes no allowances for the difference. And even even if slavery was American persecution and apartheid was South African persecution, the issues are so much more complicated and different, and there are so many more issues that need to be considered in one case and in another case, whether and the fact that a situation is devised with a minority in mind, not a majority. You know, it's just, it's not to say that, you know, I don't want to use the term because I think there are, I don't want to say the term African problems, African solutions for African problems, because that's not the case. But there are peculiarities of every unjust situation that a society has to deal with that situation in mind. And as soon as, I mean, to import it in here, I mean, people seem to say that because Black South Africans don't have the full economic ownership of the country, they are not fully empowered. If you hold political power, there is a lot of power that you wield that you are never going to, as a minority, wield. You depend on a sound constitution, and you depend on a democratic state when you're a minority, in the same way as you do as a majority. But being the majority being an issue of numbers, it's very easy for minority groupings or disadvantaged groupings, and that I say, you know, looking at sort of what would be a large group, which is women. If you can't address your rights, irrespective of whether you're a minority or majority, poor, rich, white, black, male, female.
Definitely. And yeah, personally, I find the idea behind white monopoly capital quite dumb, because our president is a billionaire. I mean, who's going to buy him, or who could have bought him? But personally, I think the reason why this is being pushed, if we, for example, would look at ourselves as individuals like Donald and Sara, but these people who look at themselves as black people have a problem in terms of there are many African leaders that have failed. And we would say that's socialism, that's just individuals that are practicing socialism. But because they don't see that, they have to come up with the reasons why this is happening. And here arrives critical race theory to justify that. That is the answer to the failures of African leaders.
I mean, one of the problems is that when most African countries obtained independence from colonial masters, particularly the French, the English, and the Portuguese, and because many of the liberation movements had as their sort of sponsors Russia and China, particularly Russia, they were imbued in every sense with the socialist structure and with the idea of a sort of Marxist utopia being the ultimate aim for society. Now we're in a position now where we know what fundamental flaws there are when you don't give individual rights supremacy over group rights. Group rights should follow individual rights. If the individual is protected, the group will be protected, but not necessarily the other way around. And the tendency for groups, for African countries to follow the socialist model, it's an economically problematic model. It feeds, it'll collapse in on itself eventually, and that's what we face now. The countries that are either changing or sort of did or changed dramatically, or didn't, or just went straight for a variation of capitalism. Their economies are improving, and as their economies improve, the lives of their peoples improve, etc., etc. And of course, what's happened is the ANC's goal was always to move along a socialist line towards Marxism, and that's been the basis of all its policies since the Mbeki era. And I mean, the Mbeki era wasn't perfect, but we had economic growth. And the minute you do anything that affects economic growth, you're going to put stresses on the society, and you're going to look for excuses. And I mean, white monopoly capital is a perfect example, because it was not a thing. It was paid for by the Zuma government to an English firm, a marketing PR firm that created the concept to use as a battering ram. And you know, when you hear people talk about white monopoly capital, you realize, you know, it is looking to find blame, because it's an invented idea, and it's not an idea that in the reality of South African economic life, they're not cutting away bits of the pie, of the economic pie. Basically, you want anyone in this country who can grow that pie, and pies can grow, you know, enormously. You grow the pie, there's more available for people to benefit from. It's when you say, well, this is the pie, this is white monopoly capital, let's get that out, or let's put in place that policy which is detrimental, whatever color you may be, that causes a lack of investment, expropriation without compensation, we would argue is one of those policies. But as long as you're not growing the pie, your economy is going to falter. At best stagnate, and then eventually falter. And we've seen that. I mean, you can't even begin to calculate how badly our economy has fared from where it came from. And it doesn't need to be. It's a policy issue. It's not a personal issue. It's not a white or black issue. It's purely an economic policy issue.
I love that analogy. We're basically fighting over the morsels of a very small pie, and we need to grow that pie. And I've been to Rwanda, and it's fascinating. I mean, in 1994, they had a genocide. And since then, because they had 10% average growth, race is not at all an issue in that country anymore. It just goes to show that if you focus on the right policies, people, their lives improve, and they don't worry about things like race anymore. But
yeah, sorry.
Sure. No, you can go.
Now, what I was just saying, one of the problems with well, I don't want to say problems with Rwanda, but your economic policy makes it different, even when you've got a strong man like Paul Kagame as your leader. And human rights, probably not, let's say, not ideal in Rwanda, but he's tuned into what investors are looking for to make an attractive investment. Investors are not necessarily the most moral, upright people. They want a return on their investment. If you can give them a return, they will put in, and you grow. It may sound sort of a little bit sort of unexotic, but that's basically how it works. Whether your investment is internal or external, that's what. If you can, it's enlightened or unenlightened self-interest. If you can make a business grouping happy about what they can take out of your country, you'll benefit individuals. And then it also goes to having enough respect for individuals to do their own thing and to make money their own way. And whether it be as an employee or whether it be an entrepreneur, doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, definitely Paul Kagame's reign hasn't been spotless. I mean, the disappearance of a few opposition leaders are definitely troubling. But coming back to critical race theory, do you think one of the reasons for its rise is also because we have become so accustomed to making the ideals of democracy and giving the youth a say in everything virtuous, that this is, I mean, critical race theory is essentially what you would see in a BA classroom. That basically we are seeing the youth taking over our lives, taking over our politics, and we should try to curtail and get to the middle again, where we respect both the older generation and the younger generation.
Well, I mean, my colleagues will tease me, I have quite a lot of younger colleagues who are very, very bright and very articulate. But I think most of the people my generation will agree that the one thing youth doesn't have by virtue of being youth, they can have knowledge, they can be extremely bright, but they don't have experience. And it's often
wisdom.
And wisdom. And it's theoretically why, and it doesn't always apply, obviously, but it is that experience that is why people become mostly, not entirely, but mostly become the CEOs of companies in their 40s and 50s, or become leaders of political parties or governments in their 50s or 60s. It's because you have to, well, if you want to do it well, you need to understand things that are not just gained through knowledge, they are gained through experience. And one of the things experience teaches you is that, pardon the pun, life isn't black and white. There are so many issues that come in that you don't understand necessarily or appreciate fully until you've actually been exposed to them. And they're not a hard and fast set of rules. Through your working life, you'll be exposed to things often unexpectedly that can have a huge impact in how you, for example, deal with people as employees afterwards. And I think the problem is, well, I'm starting to sound like the parent that I am, but one of the problems is that sort of the generations of the 90s onwards, what you've tended to see, I know it sounds terrible, not enough discipline, but discipline of kids. In other words, teaching kids that there is a way to behave in society, and sometimes you show a level of respect you don't always feel. You give due to older people until you're in a position to acceptably challenge a view. You can ask questions. You don't have to take somebody's opinion, but it's often the way you respond to people. I mean, the simple thing, like if you teach children to greet an adult, they're not going to necessarily do it automatically until you've taught them to do it. Now, it's a fairly shallow thing, but it creates a sense of how you deal with people, particularly in a context where you don't know people. And those are all the sorts of things where I think a lot of kids generally have not got a sense of the value of perspective. And I think the problem with why CRT is attractive is it tends to sort of appeal to the sense of the unjust. And youngsters will have a very strong sense of injustice and what is just and what is unjust. But on the other hand, they may also have a sense of, how can I put it? They may not have enough sense of the perspective of the broader society and the history. Now, I'll give you what I mean by that is, one of the reasons I think one's seen CRT particularly dominant or happening in private schools as opposed to public schools is that, except for a few bursary kids, the kids of every color who are at a private school are privileged. They have usually a reasonably good home life. They have essentially elite schooling. In other words, I think you have a combination of white guilt on the one side and black guilt, but for a different reason. I think for black kids, sometimes it's a guilt that they are doing okay and they do live in good circumstances, whereas a lot of black kids do not. So it's very easy to play on the guilt and infuse it with the sense of injustice. And I think that those two issues of sort of discipline in upbringing and that sense of being able to play on what are very raw emotional issues are part of the problem.
Yeah, but perhaps not go back to actually whacking your child, but just the idea that an older person on average might know more than you do. That's just a basic principle that I think it's conducive to a productive society.
I mean, how often, we were told to be polite and greet people, and my sister and I would go back into our bedrooms and say that that person's a real doofus, But there are appropriate ways of behaving when you're dealing with people you don't know. And I think, my impression, and I may be wrong, I spent many years on school governing bodies in public schools, but my impression is that we're dealing with a generation, particularly the girls, and this is not a bad thing necessarily at all, but there's a confidence level that I don't remember girls of my age having. And that's great, but it doesn't derogate from the fact that there are going to be girls, and particularly, I'm just using the example of girls, but the same can happen with boys, and particularly kids, and high school kids and primary school kids, where they can be susceptible to being bullied. And in a way, critical race theory, impinging on people's sense of guilt and privilege, is a form of bullying.
Definitely.
And people, I think people, you know, we know what the risks are with kids and mental health issues if they're pushed, and sometimes the worst does happen.
If we can pivot, there has been an article critical of the Institute of Race Relations' current critical race theory stance. They're saying that you are deviating from your past, you are abandoning your past, you're no longer, I don't know why I'm using so many ways to say that, but you're no longer adhering. You're no longer adhering to your past. Is that a credible response? Are these people giving you a credible response?
We don't believe so. And I put it this way: the principles of the are classical liberalism, and they're not exotic principles. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, free market society, property rights. That's what we believe in. So in other words, anything that enhances those, expands those, is what we will promote. And the problem we have with critical race theory in terms of breaching the freedoms is it does have an effect of breaching the freedom of speech, because what happens with a critical race theory approach to dealing with children and their attitudes to racism is because kids will feel less inclined to participate and question. They will often be subject to being called out, being called names, being expressions of horror, being cancelled. You know, they may not say things, or they may not participate, or they may not belong. That to me is a very early and unfortunate indication that your freedom of speech and your freedom of association is being narrowed. And at the very age when you should be teaching children, who you may or may not have disciplined more or less rigidly, that's the age when they should be allowed to express and oppose each other on views, and then learn to understand what other people's views are, even if they don't change your mind, or vice versa, or maybe they will change your mind, or what a teacher may say. Now, one of the problems, and I'll go out from it, is because it's occurred to me while we speak. One of the biggest problems with CRT in schools are for teachers, because it's often a system imposed. They are obliged to adopt a certain approach to race relations, and either they don't know enough about it, so they feel uncomfortable, but they can't oppose it, and they don't want to lose jobs, or they just feel they perfectly understand it, but it's not intuitive. It doesn't make sense. It's not common sense to narrow debate instead of expanding it. And that's essentially, we say that when it comes to teaching kids how to understand each other, they're not going to do it by not talking to each other.
But I mean, some of these individuals that have written critical of your current stance, aren't they past members of the Institute of Race Relations?
The vast majority, when we had a look at it, saw that the vast majority had been involved prior to the democratic dispensation. And what happened in the few years leading up to it is there was essentially two camps. The one was a camp that wanted to really align with the UDF and the ANC. And then there's the other camp that said, you either have classically liberal principles or you don't. So in other words, if you're critical of the apartheid government, you're critical of the ANC if it does not recognize and behave recognize your freedoms and behave in a liberal, democratic way. I won't go into sort of how the thing panned out, but essentially the latter group won, if I can put it that way. It's a bit blunt. And it was a huge issue. I mean, one of the former members who worked for the Institute and is a member of the council, Jill Wenzel, wrote a book called The Liberal Slide Away. And in it, she was dealing with exactly that. The idea of liberals sort of losing their classical liberal stance to favor an incoming potential black government, instead of sticking by their principles, that you hold them to account irrespective of who they are and irrespective and if they do the wrong thing, you hold them to account. And that's really the position we take. That's not to say we won't be constructive. And we have given, and Cyril Ramaphosa has even quoted some of our figures, but we gave the ANC its due when it had really improved things dramatically in the first 10 years. Not so much since. But, that's how things turned out.
So Sara, how do we prevent this? How do we stop critical race theory? What do you think is the solution to prevent this from completely destroying our education system?
Yeah, you see, the problem is that whoever's experiencing it is very reticent to come forward, whether it be a parent or a teacher, and so it's a fairly gradual process. Is as you do, what we tend to do is we make ourselves available to give advice to parents as to how to tackle it, who to tackle it with, and if we can be of assistance, we'll get involved. But people have criticized us for not naming the schools that we're aware of. But if you want to deal with a problem as sensitive as critical race theory, you're not going to help going into the press and saying this school, this school, this school, this school. You want people to have an opportunity to change their mind. But we write articles, we talk about it. Thank you. It's about getting the debate out there and getting it honest, because very often the criticism leveled at us is, but it's not critical race theory. And my feeling is, okay, A, let's talk about it. Let's see what it's really called. And B, whatever it's called, it's not good. So it's not the fact that it's as we perceive it, that it's critical race theory coming in. It's that the principles being applied are very, very negative. So it's articles, it's talks, it's getting the debate out there. It's parents and teachers who are prepared to let us assist them to get it out there, or to progress the matter with a school or with a Department of Education. So it's very much like a lot of the issues that liberals have to deal with, other than the hardy-dars who have way too much freedom of speech, is you've got to get it out there. And you get it out there by talking about it, freedom of speech. And because it does raise sensitivities. And I must say, look, it's not always white parents alone who are unhappy about seeing it in schools. A lot of black parents are not happy about it either. So it's a gradual thing, because you've got that sort of there's a sort of self-righteousness that goes with the principles of victimhood versus the victimizer. People will feel very reluctant. So it narrows your ability to speak out, your sense of comfort. You often need a critical mass of supporters to get out there. And look, you've seen it in the States with a lot of the academics, particularly, who've become very vocal on the subject. And we're now becoming vocal on the subject, and we're happy to do it. We're more than happy to debate it and prove wrong. As I said, if it's called something else, or we should be calling it something else, we'll do so.
But on a more fundamental and systemic level, probably also we need to devolve the powers of education. That will probably also solve this problem, and we need to defeat the ANC.
Well, yeah, you see, the problem is that it's not, in our experience so far, and it's been very short, so I don't want to overinflate it, but our experience has been it's in predominantly in private schools, where you have a private school body in charge of how the curricula the schools use. And it's becoming apparent that a lot of this is coming from higher up. It's happening we've had it, a couple of government schools we've been approached, but they tend to be schools that are either geographically close to or very similar to private schools. So they kind of attune to, they're amenable to that sort of issue for the same reason the private schools are. But I think in a way, with government, with provincial departments, we'll see, because we'll be getting there. But it's almost easier to take a government department on this issue than it is to take the private sector. But because of the size of the government sector and the fact that they are not, at the moment, we're still talking about public schools that are sort of elite schools, what one would call really good models, former Model C schools. It's not the government sector yet. It's a private sector, but of course, more people, black and white parents, are taking their kids to private schools, so it makes sense.
That's interesting. But I mean, Sara, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
Okay. Well, if you're going to let me plug it, I'd like to plug our website, which is it's called Educate, Don't Indoctrinate, and it's basically EDONTI. It's a contraction, EDONTI.org, and there we give a breakdown of what is critical race theory, what is the language of critical race theory, a whole lot of views on the issue. We also have a media section which basically contains videos, articles, which I update regularly as something interesting comes on. Either we write or we take stuff from overseas. And it's a site where if you want to get in touch with us, you complete a form online, it comes through to us, and we will be in contact with anyone who wants to talk. But the reticence, that's part of the reason, because of the reticence, we've made it as sort of unproblematic as possible for people to get hold of us. But it's a nice resource, even if you don't want to talk to us.
Yeah, I believe that's a great resource. I definitely recommend anyone to check that out. But I mean, thank you so much, Sara. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.